Feed Your Family Tonight podcast. Each week, we are serving up motivation and inspiration to help you get weeknight dinner on the table, letting you recapture a little calm in the crazy. And now, your host, speaker, author, and married mother of four, Mariefiebach.
Hello, friends. Welcome to the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast, episode 113. Today's episode is a replay of an episode that I recorded in the middle of the early stages of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, titled The Emotional Burden of Feeding Your Family. This episode dives into so many things that weigh on us as we consider feeding our families. And I think it's really a great episode to share this time of year as we get ready for the new year and start thinking about what habits do we want to build in the new year and how can these habits help us make dinner a little bit easier. So sit back, enjoy. I'll be back next week with an all new episode. Happy New Year, friends. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast. I'm your host, Mariefiebach, and today is episode 75. It's hard to believe 75 episodes in, but I kind of like that today's podcast is on a nice round number. It's a little bit different today. Today, I am going to be talking about the emotional burden of feeding your family. And I want to preface this by saying that I love feeding my family. It is something that I actively choose and I do enjoy it. But that also doesn't mean that it doesn't come with burdens. Today's podcast is going to be a little bit different. I am a little nervous because I'm going to choose to be a little bit raw and a little bit real about some of the behind the scenes of my family that I haven't shared too much publicly about. We're all having all the feels right now. For me, knowing that I'm not alone and that other people are experiencing some of the same things I'm experiencing can help me. The other thing is sometimes hearing other people's experiences brings to light the reality of what's happening in my world. I'll explain that a little bit later, because I definitely had a few aha moments. So that's kind of the point of today's podcast is, first of all, is I want you to first and foremost know that feeding your family is worthy and it is a good thing to do. Second thing is I want you to know that that doesn't mean it's not hard. The third thing is I hope that in sharing a little bit of my story, you might recognize a few of the things that might be happening even completely subconsciously for you. For me, sometimes just giving something a name makes the burden a little easier to bear. So that's what today's podcast is going to be about. The beginning of the inspiration for this podcast probably happened in December when I listened to another podcast. I love Lisa Woodruff of Organized 365. In December, she had Eve Rodsky on her podcast. Eve Rodsky is the author of the book Fair Play. I will link to the book and I will link to the podcast. I want to tell you, I have not read the book, but listening to this interview with Eve, there were so many things that came to light, and I found myself stopping it and playing it for my husband. We both felt validated by listening to her story. Eve, when she was talking with Lisa, talks about the story of the French's yellow mustard. She says, little Johnny will only eat his proteins with French's yellow mustard. He won't eat his hot dogs. He won't eat his chicken. He won't eat his little pieces of ground beef unless he has a dollop of French's yellow mustard on his plate. And Mom knows this. And Mom notices that she's getting a little bit low on French's yellow mustard, so she puts it on the grocery list. Mom's getting a little stressed out, and so Dad comes in and says, let me take something off your hands. And he said, I'll go to the grocery store for you. And she has this really good grocery list. And on the list says French's yellow mustard. And Dad gets to the grocery store and French's makes 5 different kinds of mustard. And Dad comes home with grainy, spicy Dijon French's mustard. Mom's upset because she knows that little Johnny's not going to eat his hot dogs tonight because he doesn't have the regular French's yellow mustard. She's upset that Dad got the wrong kind of mustard. And Dad feels upset because he got what was on the list. It was French's, it was yellow, it was mustard. He didn't know that Johnny won't eat his proteins without French's yellow mustard. And he didn't know that there's a difference between yellow mustard and Dijon mustard. He likes Dijon mustard. He got the kind of French's mustard he likes. And he's like, why do I even try helping you? Because I can't get it right. And the mom is like, why do I even ask for help? Because you can't get it right. And when I heard this story that Eve said on Lisa's podcast, I was like, yes, 100 times yes. It's no one's fault. No one made the mistake, but you think back, there are so many tiny calculations that mother had made. First of all, she knows that Johnny won't eat proteins without mustard. She knows the brand of mustard. She knows the kinds of mustard. She knows that she's getting low on the mustard. She gets the mustard on the grocery list. And the last little step is just to get it at the grocery store. And that step wasn't followed through correctly. But then Dad doesn't know that Johnny will only eat his proteins with French's yellow mustard. Dad knows that there's usually meat and something else on the plate, but he doesn't pay attention to exactly what it is because he doesn't need to. He doesn't have ownership of that piece of the puzzle. When you are feeding your family, there are dozens of little yellow mustard incidences that you are calculating in your head at a subconscious level, and you don't even know it. This week's been hard. My kids had their first week of distance learning last week, and on Friday, all of the emotions came to a head. I had one kid. Now, mind you, my kids are 12 to 17, so they are big enough to understand what's happening in the world and why we're doing what we're doing. But one of my kids went into a complete hysterics, crying, sobbing fit for at least 45 minutes because one of my other kids used their towel. Now, all my kids have monogram towels so that I know whose towel is on the floor. And I know where to look for the towels if they're not where they belong when I'm going to wash the towels. It's something that we've done since our kids were little. And it's really kind of handy in our house to have everybody so we know whose towel is whose. But one of my kids used the other kid's towel. That kid was upset. But I knew it really wasn't about the towel. It was just that it had been a long, hard week. And distance learning was hard, and they felt cooped up, and they missed their friends and trying to figure out what our new normal is. We've had so many changes happen so quickly that it is so hard for our minds to catch up with what is happening. 2 other kids had a giant squabble over breakfast that was over nothing. And I knew on Friday that my kids were hurting, that they were experiencing grief. And my job as mom was to stay calm. Now, I can be a bit dramatic. I'm usually not the calm, everything is great kind of mom, but on Friday, I was because I had to be. But I was still constantly calculating which kid's problem needed to have the most attention. What order did I need to give my children attention? And I was calculating which kid needed the most of me right now. Because while I have 4 children, there is only one of me. And they have all been very needy this week. And I've had to choose and calculate the order of how I'm giving myself to them. That was Friday. Sunday, it was Mama's turn to break down. And it kind of started Sunday morning. My kids like to sleep in, so it wasn't super early in the morning. And I'm awake, sitting in bed, talking to my husband. And I said, I don't know what to make for breakfast. And my husband's like, well, just make breakfast. On Sunday mornings, usually in our family, I make a nicer breakfast. I make things that I don't make during the week. I'll make pancakes or muffins or hash browns and bacon or sausage and different combinations of those things. It's usually kind of a bigger breakfast. It's kind of one of our big meals of the day. He said, well, how about you make this? Or how about you make that? And I kept saying, I can't. And what was really happening was I realized that there is not a single breakfast food that my entire family will eat without complaint. I've got several kids that won't eat eggs. I have one kid that can't have dairy. And I have another kid that if I put almond milk or coconut milk in any baked good instead of regular dairy milk, they can taste it and they won't eat it and they will complain and they will be upset. And I have one person that won't eat bacon and I have one person that won't eat sausage. And there is not a single thing that I can make that everybody will be happy with. And so I have to calculate, who am I going to make fend for themselves? Now, in a family of 6, there are very few meals that everyone will eat happily. There are many meals that everyone will eat, but there's always one person that isn't super happy with it. And then there's plenty of meals where I know that one person is going to have to fend for themselves. And the rule in our house is if you don't want to eat what's served for dinner, that's fine. You can make yourself something else. But I'm having to choose and rotate around which kid is making something for themselves. And I knew that on Friday, my kid that is allergic to fish wasn't going to eat what the rest of the family was eating because I was making fish tacos for dinner. So that kid had to fend for themselves. I've got my kid that won't eat dairy. And when we had pizza, they ate theirs without cheese, but it's just not the same. So that kid was kind of fending for themselves. And I know that another kid really should be eating low carb because it's better for them. And so I don't want to make a big giant cinnamon roll thing because it's just too much carbs for that kid. And I need to help them be as healthy as possible. And so all of these small little micro calculations that I was making in my head all the time came to a head on Sunday. And I was able to articulate to my husband that was why it was hard for me to figure out what to make for breakfast, because I was choosing which kid had to fend for themselves. And one of the things that I do completely unconsciously, it was never conscious until Sunday, is I'm trying to rotate around which kid is fending for themselves. So it's not always the same kid. Do you do that in your house? I suspect there's a few listeners out there that do. And then as I'm sitting there talking to my husband, and of course, if I say talking, really, I'm crying because I'm upset and overwhelmed and all of the feels of being cooped up and not being able to get the groceries that I want, not being able to go to the grocery store and having my children here all the time was just kind of wearing on me. And I was in grief. Now, I've worked for cemeteries. I worked for cemeteries for many years selling cemetery plots, and I have seen families in grief. It manifests itself in really strange ways. There are the people that go completely into task mode when a family member dies, and they make a list of everything that needs to be done, and they are there checking things off the list, making very logical, crisp, and clear, decisive decisions. There are the people that in grief start cracking really inappropriate jokes. That is the only way that they know how to cope with the pain that is happening around them. There are the people that can't get through a sentence without choking up and sobbing and crying. And there are the people that go into complete apathy and they're like, whatever, doesn't matter. You pick, I don't care. And all of them are normal. I was in grief. I'm mourning what my life used to be, and I'm coming to terms with all the changes and what my life is now. And I was in the sobbing stage where I couldn't get through a sentence without crying. That was where grief was manifesting itself with me. And as I'm talking to my husband about breakfast and how I'm choosing and calculating, it dawned on me that I do that so much more with feeding my family. One example is we get our beef from a local farmer. And when you get beef bones. And I want to be frugal and I want to be a good steward of my resources and I don't want things to go to waste. And so I make beef soup and I like beef soup. My beef soup is good. I make a good beef soup. I've got a whole podcast on beef soup. You can listen to it. But I made beef soup and my husband says, I just don't like soup. And he didn't finish the soup that was served and threw it away. And this happened several weeks ago, and I was crestfallen. I was so hurt that he threw away my soup. And again, we have means. It's not that. We are good stewards of our food budget and we try to use our food wisely. My family is very carnivorous. We eat a lot of meat. That's just a lot of it is how our bodies thrive. There are some people whose bodies thrive more on carbs and some people whose bodies thrive more on protein. Most of the people in my family, their bodies thrive with a lot of protein, which is fine. It is what it is. I had made the beef soup and I had roasted the bones and I had let the soup simmer and I was taking the meat off the bones. And my husband, since a very young age, like 7 or 8 years old, has been very adverse to anything fatty. And I know this about him. He freely admits it that, fat or gristle or any kind of connective tissue just bothers him, which is fine. That's how he is. As I was cutting up the meat for this beef soup, knowing that my husband was very selective about his meat, I had gone and carefully and painstakingly separated out the meat that did not have fat and did not have connective tissue. And I had set it aside just for him. And I had put it in a bowl. With beef soup, when you're feeding 6 people, there is plenty of meat for everybody, but there's not a lot of extra meat. It's not like there's a big roast there and everybody can have all the meat that they want. And I serve most of our meals from the stove and I plate it and then they take it to the table. And this particular night I had taken the soup. I had painstakingly tried to get the non-fatty pieces of meat for my husband and put it in a bowl and then poured the rest of the soup with the vegetables and the broth over his special bowl of soup. I had put in that effort. Then I had served everybody else soup. He picked at his soup and didn't eat half of it and then threw it away. I was crestfallen. I was so hurt. And I told him that I was crestfallen and was hurt. But what I didn't realize until Sunday morning, why I was hurt. I was hurt because I had worked hard to give him the best. And then I had fed each of my children according to their needs. One kid, wants a little bit more potatoes and a little bit less corn. And the other kid doesn't want too many green beans. And the other kid wants a bowl full of meat and noodles and nothing else. And I had gone and fed my husband the best. And then I had selected out bowls of soup for my children. And none of this is conscious, by the way. I'm just pouring bowls of soup. But subconsciously, I'm calculating. And in the end, there is very little meat left for me, which is fine. I am not wanting for meat, but to see my husband throw away what I had selected to be the best and I did without was very hurtful to me. And on Sunday, I was able to articulate to my husband. And I said, this is why I was so upset about the soup a few weeks ago. And I said, I didn't even realize it until now, but I had calculated and served everybody according to my needs. And you threw away something that I would have wanted for myself, as if it was less than stellar. How many times do you make little micro calculations? Maybe you've got one kid that needs a little bit more carbs, or you've got one kid that you're worried isn't getting quite enough protein, so you're making sure to put an abundance of it on their plate, so maybe they'll eat half of it. Maybe you have a family member that doesn't prefer mushrooms, and so anytime you see a recipe with mushrooms, you just flip over in the recipe book. Or maybe you're like me and you've got picky kids, and you've got one kid that will eat one thing, another kid that'll eat another thing, and they're not the same things. And you're calculating which kid is going to have to fend for themselves. And not only that, but you're calculating to make sure that you have the ingredients in the house for them to fend for themselves. So if you have a kid that's not going to eat fish, you want to make sure that you've got a box of macaroni and cheese, or you've got tortillas and cheese for them to make a quesadilla, or you've got a can of beans so that they can make themselves a bean burrito, or you have peanut butter and jelly, but your kid doesn't like the natural kind of peanut butter because they find it watery and oily. So you make sure that you find another brand of organic peanut butter that your kid will eat that is healthy according to the standards that you have set for yourself in your head. But it's okay for your kid, and your kid thinks it's good because it's spreadable and they can spread it on their own peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. There are 1,000 micro decisions that we are making when we are in charge of feeding our household day in and day out. And those little micro decisions contribute to the emotional burden of feeding our family. And sometimes trying to plan meals for your family day in, day out. And especially now when we're having to do 3 meals a day for our family. We've got breakfast, we've got lunch, we've got dinner, we've got snacks, and we have all of the dishes that go with each of those meals. It gets to be too much. And the emotional burden is heavy. And I'm not saying this in a woe is me kind of way. I'm saying this because by being able to see that I am making all these micro calculations, it makes it easier to make the micro calculations because they are now brought to the surface and I can see that that is what I'm doing, rather than being upset that I don't know what to make for breakfast. But the reason I don't know what to make for breakfast is because there's not a single breakfast food that everyone in my family will eat without complaint. Well, then I just know that I have to pick who's going to fend for themselves. I know that one kid fended for themselves on Thursday, another kid fended for themselves on Friday. And so now it's like, okay, well, it's the next kid's turn. So we're going to make the foods that appeal to the other 3 kids or appeal to the husband. And the 4th kid, it's their turn to fend for themselves. The little micro decisions are one of the things that make it hard to meal plan week in and week out. But I will tell you that choosing to meal plan puts all of those micro decisions into one time and place, and you're not having to make them every day. So the burden of making those micro decisions happens at one time for the meal planning. You still might be making those micro decisions when you're divvying up the portions like I do, where I've got one kid that needs to have a little bit more meat and one kid that needs to have a little bit more carbs. And I'm calculating that as I'm dishing out the stir fry to make sure that this one kid gets the extra vegetables and this other kid gets the extra meat and this other kid gets the extra noodles. I'm still making those, but at least I've made the decision of what I'm going to make at the beginning of the week, and I've compressed some of those micro decisions. If you don't have my master meal planning sheet, it's at feedyourfamilytonight.com/master. And that sheet is a way for you to say, oh, I haven't made this in a long time. And you can look at that master meal planning sheet and help you when you're trying to make those decisions. Get the weekly meal planning sheet too while you're at it, because it's really useful too. It's at feedyourfamilytonight.com/plan. And it helps you get your week's meal plans done in one time, lifting a little bit of that emotional burden. Not all of it, but a little bit. Because you're compressing a lot of those micro decisions into one time. It's hard now. It's hard not to be able to go to the grocery store whenever you want. It's hard to have to constantly be making substitutions. I asked people in the Feed Your Family Tonight Facebook group and on Instagram, what's hard about cooking now? Or is cooking even harder? And there's a few families where it's actually easier because their biggest burden was no one was ever home at the same time. And so they were having to calculate when they were going to make dinner. Were they going to make dinner early so that people could have before they went to activities? Were they going to have dinner late after all the activities were done? And they're like, this is great. We are all home at the same time. So my biggest burden for meal planning has been lifted because our whole family is home at the same time. There's other people that they're like, the dishes. I have so many dishes. And I'm like, I'm right there with you. I'm running my dishwasher 2 to 3 times a day right now, which again, I'm so happy to do, but it's more work than it used to be because my kids had baggies in their lunch boxes and all those little containers were thrown away. So I didn't have to worry about lunch dishes. I had baggies that were tossed that I didn't have to clean. No matter what, I want you to know that feeding your family is enough. When we set ideals in our minds for how we should do it, kind of like the peanut butter example, where the ideal is the all natural peanut butter, but you're having to compromise because A, you can't find it in the store, or B, your kid doesn't find it spreadable. And so you're giving to them something that you think is lesser, but you're still doing your best. You are doing your best and you are enough. And as we're not going to the grocery store as frequently and we can't get the groceries that we want, and we're trying to calculate what kind of substitutions we're going to make right now, which is happening to all of us on one level or another, know that it's okay. Know that it's hard, and know that your body is going to experience a little bit of grief. And however that grief comes out, whether you're the sobber, the taskmaster, the person who's cracking inappropriate jokes, or the person who's gone into complete apathy, you're normal, you're okay, and you're gonna get through this. I would love to continue this discussion in the Feed Your Family Tonight Facebook group. I want to know what is burdening you, and also ways that you have gotten past the burdens, because we still have to feed our families, even if it is hard. I thank you for listening to me and understanding that I'm not perfect. And while my kids joke and they call me the food lady, I don't have all the answers, and it's certainly not utopia in my house. I struggle every day too. I'm right there with you and I understand. I hope you understand that being vulnerable is my way of saying that I care about you and that you're okay. So for now, friends, thanks so much for joining us on the Feed Your Family Tonight podcast. I look forward to talking with you in the Facebook group. Follow me on Instagram if you want to know some of the crazy antics that have been happening these past few weeks. There's always something to make you laugh. Oh my goodness. I'm at Mariefiebach on Instagram, so I'd love to connect with you there. And we'll catch you next time. Take care, friends.
Thanks for listening to Feed Your Family Tonight podcast with your host, Mariefiebach. If you like the show and want to know more, please visit feedyourfamilytonight.com. And if you'd like to help support the show, please leave a rating or review on iTunes or Apple Podcast. It helps spread the word that you can feed your family tonight.